Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. Now, a few months ago, I made a video all about super tuning the classic Scalextric 1275 GT Mini, and that video went down really well and you guys really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, YouTube didn't really enjoy the soundtrack. So a few weeks after that video went up, or at least some time after that video went up, YouTube decided that they were going to have a ding-dong with me, and that resulted in half of the audio on that video being stripped out. Now that's a big loss, because all the guys that haven't seen it and then they saw it afterwards complained to me that they wanted to listen to the audio and the words that I was saying, but of course they've all been sort of stripped out because of YouTube. So with that in mind, I've spent the last few months finding all the parts to make my own 1275 GT model, because the one that I built in that video wasn't mine, but this one is going to be mine. So I'm going to remake this video now, building my own car using exactly the same parts, and I'm not going to be quite as detailed in this video. I'm going to kind of speed through it a little bit, because if you want to get all the really small detail, you can always go back to watch that video and then you'll understand what's going on anyway because of this video. So I'm just going to sort of run through it a little bit quicker, but I'm also going to add my own paint job onto my own car, because I've seen an image of the 1275 GT with a black and white paint job and a checkered roof, and I do love me a checkered roof, and I want to make that my own car. So we're going to rerun this video now a little bit quicker than the original video. I'm going to show you everything that I put in this car. We'll do all the work, we'll put a paint job on it, we'll go back to the Crow Valley, and we're going to see if I can get a time that was similar to the original build that I did. So let's get you on my table and show you the parts that I've got. So first of all, to get this project going, I'm going to need myself a very good condition Mini 1275 GT body, which I have here, and I'm also going to need myself a Mini 1275 GT chassis in good condition, which I also have here, with good chrome and also a very good bumper. And I'd like to thank my friend Mac for finding me this chassis, because they're not easy to find with good chrome and the bumpers all intact. But here we have a nice chassis ready to go. So that is my body and chassis all ready. So next we're going to want some decals to put on that body. Now these decals are sold by a seller on eBay. I've used him a number of times and his service is very good, but I've yet to actually use the decals on a project. So this will be the first time I use them. Now this guy used to do these decals here only in the white. I've asked him if he could do them in the black, and he has. So I've got a spare one here in case I mess it up. So we got ourselves a nice black checkered roof. And also, as part of the other kit that he does, we've got these very nice side stripes and numbers and other bits and bobs. I'm going to leave this particular job a little bit plain, because I really only want the stripes and the 1275 GT badging along the bottom. But we've also got some number plates which we will use as well, possibly one or two other bits and bobs. But there we are. So there we are. So we've got a lovely set of water slide decals from eBay. So one of the biggest problems that we all know the old classic Mini has is a top heavy body. So I've developed this vacuum formed interior and also this vacuum formed glass to lighten the weight in the body, and these help dramatically in the performance department. And I've also got myself a nice green helmet man, because you need the helmet for the interior because it doesn't come with a helmet. So that's the interior sorted. And for a high performance car, you need high performance wheels. So Pendle Slot Racing sell a whole range of alloy wheels with rubber to suit for their kits and other people's kits that you want to build. So these are a very nice set of very high quality aluminium wheels with tyres to match, and these tyres are very, very grippy. They're the F22 compound, so they're not the stickiest compound, but they're more than good enough for the job. Also, Pendle Slot Racing do a very nice range of resin or 3D printed inserts to go in your wheels, and I've chosen these inserts, the same as the original build, to put on this car. It is incredibly important that you use good quality axles if you want to make a car go fast, and these Slotting Plus axles will do the job very, very nicely indeed. And obviously we're going to need some bearings to hang our axles from. So these Pendle Slot Racing ABO1 bearings are absolutely perfect, and they're a direct replacement for the original bearing, and they'll fit straight in to our Mini chassis. Now these classic Minis don't really appreciate being overpowered, because they've got certain dimensional problems with them which would facilitate the need for a more mild motor. So Pendle Slot Racing do this extremely nice S-Can motor. It's only 20,000 RPM, but that's absolutely more than enough for a standard Mini. And we're going to fit a very, very high quality set of gears in this car. So we're going with a slotted inline 5.5mm 8-tooth pinion. And on the other end of the drivetrain, we're going to use the slotted crown gear at 27 tooth. These are really high quality gears and they'll do the job beautifully. Now obviously we're going to need something to guide this Mini, and Pendle Slot Racing do these really cool little multi-packs. So you've got a standard Slotting Plus guide in there, a couple of guide spacers, some really nice quality silicone wire, a little bit of braid, which I think is a little bit thick, but we'll come back to that later on, and also the screw to go in the guide. So that'll be a really handy one-stop shop for all your guiding needs. And last but definitely not least, I do this tuning pack for the classic Scalextric 1275 GT Mini, and that consists of 2 front axle spacers, a front axle tube, a strip of brass for holding the motor in better, an S-Can conversion so that you can fit your S-Can motor into your standard chassis, and also 2 self-tapping screws to hold the lead in and also that brass strip. So there we are, that's all the parts we're going to use in this Mini. Let's get straight to the bench and start getting them in this car. Okay, so let's get this chassis all built up. So take an axle, pop a bearing on the axle, take your gear, put your gear on the axle, and take the other bearing and put that on the axle. And then assemble everything into the chassis as one complete unit. And once it's all in and in place, snap it in place as one. And if you do it all as one, the axle guides the bearing nice and tidy straight into the chassis, and it makes the bearings nice and square, and it makes for a very, very free and free-fitting axle without the bearings being twisted. So once you've got to that point, get yourself some super glue, decant a little bit of super glue out on a surface, and then pick up the super glue with a cocktail stick and just put a tiny dot of super glue on the top of the bearing. Just hold it in place. This isn't strictly necessary because the chassis fit of those bearings is very good, but we're not going to be running the interior in this car, and the interior of the original car has 2 prongs that go down and hold those bearings. And because we're not going to be using the chassis, we don't have the safety blanket of those 2 prongs, so a little bit of glue will do the same job. So that is the back end basically finished. So the next we need to do is put the bearing, put the pinion onto the motor using a motor pinion press. And you will see that one side of the pinion has got a chamfer and the other side is square. So take the side with a chamfer, and that is the side that goes onto the motor. And then once you put the pinion on the motor, offer the motor up into the chassis, just making sure that that pinion is in exactly the right place. And I can see that that pinion is in the right place, and I'm happy. We've got good clearance between the back of the motor and the gear, and the pinion itself is lined up nicely in my gear. So now we've got that done, we can now put on the motor spacer that's inside of the Swift 16 pack that I do. So there's a little molding pip on there, so we just want to file that off. This isn't necessary at all, it's just to make it look nice. So get rid of the molding pip like that, and then actually what I would do, just as a safety precaution going forwards, is I would put a little tiny dot of oil on that motor, just a tiny little dot like that, just for the sake of safety going forwards. So once you've done that, you can push this adapter on the back of the motor, and I warn you, it's a really tight fit, so you really want to give it a good old squeeze like that. And there we are. Then you can simply clip the motor back into place for the last time, and I would put the rear of the motor into the chassis first and then drop it down in, it would be the front of the chassis, the rear of the motor. Put that in first, and then you can lower the back of the motor down in place and clip it in just like that. There we are. Right, so that's it. So now we've got the back end is all assembled, and now we can think about moving on to the front. So the first job to do when we're fitting the front end in is to get a scalpel or something sharp and scratch up the inside of that little pocket on the front of the car. It doesn't matter how good or bad a job you do with this, as long as you make a nice good few scratches in there, because we're going to put some car body filler in a moment, and we want that car body filler to grab onto something inside that chassis. So that will do me for now. That was great. And now get the tube from the inside of the packet that I do, and you want to scratch up at least half of it. Just scratch up the back of it, just to give it a little bit of a key. Again, this doesn't have to be particularly brilliant. All you're looking for is a nice key so that the car body filler has got something to grab to, and you only need to do half of this tube. You can do the top if you wanted to, but it's entirely up to you. So we got a scratched up tube and a scratched up chassis. So next we want to mix up some car body filler. So this is ordinary car body filler, Isopon P38 in this case, with a little bit of hardener. So we just want to mix all that up together on a little mixing plate like we've got here. And then once this is mixed, we want to pop it down into that hole that we've just scratched up, put the tube and the axle together, and then drop the whole thing down into the chassis. So there's a nice little dollop of filler there. And then we want to pop a little bit of car body filler down in there. We don't want to go too mad with it. We don't want to make a complete mess. So we want to put a little bit in like that. That will probably be enough. We can always add a bit more afterwards if not. Let's just try a little dot just in case. There, that should be plenty. So next we take our other axle and the brass tube and line up the scratched bit on the bottom, and then lower the axle in and allow it to clip in to its original clipped in position. There's a little bit of a clip that the original axle was on, and you can feel that little clip. So that is now in there nicely, and the axle is now free to turn. So that's now there, and all you can do then, if you wanted to, you could put a little bit over the top if you wanted to. It's not going to hurt, just like that. Really, I mean, that's just an extra. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. So next, grab a wheel quickly, because the filler's going to be going off. Pop a wheel on each corner of the car, like so, and then pop it on a setup plate, and with something of a known thickness, and I'm using some M10 bolts and nuts here, just pop a nut on each corner of the wheel so that the chassis is sitting nice and level and lifted off the floor. So those bolts now are just nice and evenly on those alloy wheels. The filler is still wet, and I can push that down and it's all nice and level, because the restrictions in the top of this chassis that were there from the original car is exactly where that axle wants to be, how we want it. So by using those original registers, that's exactly what we want by pure convenience. And all these nuts are doing is holding the chassis off the floor, because the chassis on this car is lower than these alloy wheels. So the nuts here just keep it all nice and off the plate, all nice and even, and it sits this front axle nice and square, and it allows the chassis to rest in exactly the place it wants to be, to ensure that that chassis and all the axles and the wheels are all exactly right. So we'll leave that now for about half an hour for that filler to dry, and I'll clean up the filler, put a little bit of paint on it, and then move on to the next stage. So once you've finished painting your chassis and you're happy with the front end, you can now go ahead and fit the rear tyres onto the rear wheels and screw up all the screws on the back end. Just like that. And then we need to move back to the front. So if you take the wheel spacers in the kit that I supply and just file off that little pip, in exactly the same way as you fired off the pip on the back of the motor, you can then go ahead and drill the center hole out to 2.5 millimeters. And as you can see, it's drilled out mostly on each side, so you can just do a little bit from one side and then come in from the opposite side and do a little bit from that side as well, and that actually helps to keep the hole nice and straight. And as you can see, it doesn't take very much drilling to go all the way through. So once you've done that to both of the spacers, you can then go ahead and mount those spacers to the front end, put the front tyres on the front wheels, and then put the wheels onto the car, and then we can move on to fitting the guide. Just like that. Okay, so now we've got the wheels on the chassis, it's time to think about fitting the guide. Now, I've used Pendle slot rear tyres on this car, but an old set of worn Scalextric front tyres, because they're not yet cracked and they don't offer any resistance when the car is moving about. They're very, very smooth. So depending on the tyres that you use and depending on the thickness of the braid you use on your guide, you may need to file a little bit of this plate back to lift the guide in effect, or you may need to add a couple of spacers depending on what tyres and what braid you're using. If you're adding spacers in the Pendle slot kit, they give you a couple of spacers there which you can cut off the relevant one and give them a little bit of a sand if you need to thin them down perfectly and adjust them to suit. Now, I personally have found that these front Scalextric tyres are 1/4 of a millimetre thinner on the bottom, so 1/2 millimetre overall. So that will have an effect on my braid, because the braid that I like to use is this 0.2 millimetre braid. Now, this is tinned braid from NSR, but you can use the untinned braid as well. But I like to use 0.2 braid because it has very, very little resistance to pushing the car up. With such a small, light car like this, you don't want heavy braids pushing the car up, making it do a wheelie, because it's bringing the front tyres off the track and therefore allowing the car to rock in the corners. And it's also lifting the car higher up from a centre of gravity point of view, and it makes the whole thing a bit of a problem. So when I fit my guide in the car, you can see that there is a little bit of wobble there. Now, in all honesty, that is not really a problem. You could just simply go ahead, pop a screw on the top of that post there, and you could get on with your day and have no efforts whatsoever. However, I like to be a little bit of a perfectionist, so I'm going to actually fit my Slotting Plus spacer kit onto this car. So if you want to do this with me, it's a very simple process of simply drilling out that hole in the front of the car to 4.1 millimeters. So we have our 4.1 millimeter hole there, and then you get yourself a piece of tube, which is what comes with the reaming tool itself, and simply sand it down roughly with a bit of sandpaper. It doesn't have to be particularly pretty. And then put a very small amount of super glue on the edge of that pipe. Very, very small. You don't need much at all. And then with one very quick and very positive movement, get that tube into the car like that. And then once it's dry, you can then chop it off with a scalpel, and then you can ream it out. And once it's all reamed out, you will find the guide will slide nicely into its hole, and there'll be absolutely no wobble whatsoever, but the guide is incredibly free to turn. So now you've got to that point, you can put the car on the setup plate, and you can take your braid and you can put the braid underneath the guide and just see what you're dealing with. Now, in my particular case, I've got the 0.2 braid, and you can see that there's a little bit of resistance there, which means my front tyres are just about off the surface of the car. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and fit this braid to the guide, and then I'm going to come back to the car and just see if I need to adjust it up or down. So I need to file the bottom of the car or possibly add a spacer. Okay, so having now fitted my guide, got it all working correctly, I can now see on my particular build that when I run the chassis on the setup plate, my front wheels are not actually touching the setup plate. So for me, I need to remove just the slightest amount of material of the bottom of my chassis with a file. Now for you, it might be a little bit different, but like I say, it does depend on the braid that you use and the tire that you use. So I'm going to go ahead now, I'm going to file the bottom of this chassis, and I can put my bolt into the top, and then I can solder my wires on, and that is the chassis finished in terms of running. Then we can move on to fitting the lead. Okay, so as you saw, I took a few strokes of the file on the bottom of my chassis, and I've got the guide exactly where I want it. So now when I put it on the setup plate and I put my finger on the gear, you can now roll the chassis back and forth, and you can see those front wheels are actually turning. But when I rotate the front wheels with my fingers, they're also incredibly free to rotate just off the surface of that setup plate. And that's exactly what you want when you set up the front end. You do want a little bit of compliance in the front. You don't want it hard to the track. So once you're happy with the setup of your guide, you can go ahead and you can screw your guide into place like so. And then we can simply solder on the wires to the motor. Now there's a little trick that I like to use when I solder my wires to these metal can motors. I like to put a bit of masking tape over the top of the can, because any splash from the flux when you're soldering doesn't stain the metal can, and it makes the metal can nice and clean. Okay, so the next step is to fit some lead. Now the first thing I like to do on these classic minis is chop out these little posts here, because we simply don't need them. So once they're gone, you can then measure up the lead that you need for your car and get on with cutting it out. Now I've already got a preferred shape that I like to use when in these minis, and as I'm cutting this lead out now, I will put those measurements just here. So when you've finished cutting and folding your lead, you should end up with two pieces looking just like this. And they will simply drop into the chassis, down the side of the chassis and down the side of the motor, and lay nice and flush on the inside of the chassis. And those two folded ears should drop down nicely behind the motor, just like that. So once you've got your lead all folded up and done, you then need to take your piece of brass, and it needs to fold up over the top of the motor, down the side of the motor, and out over the top of those two pieces of lead. And when you've done that, you need to drill 2 holes and put these self-tappers into the bottom of the chassis, up through the lead and into the brass to hold it all into place. So let's do that. So what I did there is I drilled a 1.9mm hole through everything on both sides. Then I removed the brass plate and I drilled a 2.2mm hole through the lead and then through the chassis itself. And that ensured that I got all my holes perfectly lined up. Now I've got all my holes drilled, I can simply put a self-tapper screw in the bottom of the chassis and then screw up into the brass, and that will pull the brass down nice and tight and also hold the lead firmly in place. And there we are. That's the chassis completely finished. Now the only things that are left to do is paint the interior and get the bodywork painted. Okay, so now we move on to painting the body. And like I said at the beginning of this video isn't really about body painting. Painting this body is just a byproduct of recreating the video of how I made the chassis for this car. So if you'd like to know about body painting or how I go about body painting, there's a video there and there's a video there that are well worth watching. They were made around about 7 months ago each, and they cover all the aspects of body painting. So all I'll say at the beginning of this particular segment now, before we montage through this whole paint job, is that I'm going to take off all these water slides, all these tampo prints with some 1000 grit wet and dry paper, because I found that's the most reliable just to get off tampo printing. There are other ways, but I find a humble piece of sandpaper of a very fine grit to do the job very well. It also keys the body up ready for primer. So let's get on, let's get this body all primed up or all ready for priming, and then we'll montage through this whole paint job and get it done quickly to save you the pain of yet another body painting video. And that's the body all painted up in a simple white. I'm personally always a little bit nervous when I'm using water slide decals for the first time from an unfamiliar manufacturer, but I found these decals to be very, very good. They come off the backing in about 15 to 20 seconds. There's plenty of glue on them, so they stick down very, very well. They're very strong, so you can float them on the surface and move them about without fear of them snapping until you want to push them down solid. And they also work extremely well with micro sol and micro set. So I'm very, very pleased with them. The only observation I can make about this particular set are these checkers weren't exactly the right shape for the roof. I ended up having to trim off a little bit around the edge just to get them to fit nicely to the roof as they are here. Mostly taking off one row of checkers because it seemed to be one row too wide, and the two end profiles needs to be re-profiled, and I used this metal paint tin, and the tin itself is exactly 4 inches in diameter, and I used that to put on the decal there and then strike a nice clean arc with a nice sharp scalpel, and that got me these clean lines on the end. They seem to suit that mini roof very, very well. So with the body now finished, we can now move on to getting the interior done and the wheel inserts. So we're now at the point where we want to fit our interior and glass, and as you just saw, I pre-prepared these ready to go. And the silver foil tape that I use is simply this stuff here. You can get it from any hardware store, and it's for doing ceiling, loft insulation and stuff like that. It's very, very inexpensive. So as you saw, what I like to do with my glass for the most part is cut out a hole in the middle of the glass and then cut a piece of silver foil tape that's just about the same size as the inside of the glass. Now, the way to determine which is the front and back on this particular glass, because it's not that easy to see, the front screen has got a slightly heavier curve than the rear screen, and also there's a very slight hairline across there with it's an extra little fold. I think you can see it there in the reflection. That's not actually a marker, it's just a happy coincidence, but it's the slightly more curved screen that goes on the front of the car, and it is definitely the right way around, because if you put this in backwards it doesn't quite fit particularly nicely. So the way that I do it is simply drop the glass into the body, square it all up nicely so it's seated correctly, and then just push the silver foil tape down onto the roof exactly where you've cut out the hole. So seat it there and then push it down nice and tight to the roof body, and then that silver foil tape will glue very, very nicely in place. And then once you've done, you've got yourself the glass. And then the interior is simply cut 2 strips. I like to cut the corners off because it looks neat, and then you simply drop the body, the interior, into the correct position, sight it up on the outside of the car to make sure it's nice and square, and when you're happy, just lay down these bits of silver foil tape onto the sides, push it down with a cotton earbud, trim the back to suit the wheel arch, and you're ready to go. So the last job we need to do before we can hit the track with this car is to fit the wheel inserts. Now, Pendle Slot Racing do these really cool wheel inserts, and they're designed to go between the back of the wheel and the front of the insert, and they come in different thicknesses. This particular set is 2.5mm. Now, these are a little bit thin for what I want, so I can't use these. So the way that I've done it this way is I've slid the whole axle over towards me here. As you can see, I've got a nice big gap, and that's allowed me to have enough axle sticking out the inside of the wheel to act as a depth stop for my wheel insert. So I've set the axle up to what I want. I've dropped the wheel insert in, and there's just the right amount of insert that I want inside the wheel. So what I've done here is I've got my super glue, I've put it onto a little pallet, and I take up a nice little dollop of super glue on a cocktail stick, and I just put 3 dots around the inside of the wheel, roughly where that wheel insert is going to land. And then I bet you can't guess what's coming next. We just simply get the wheel insert, drop it into the wheel, give it a little bit of a rotation, and then just wait until the glue sets, and that's the one wheel insert done. But if you want convenience, these are probably better. I just don't have the right depth on me now. And once you've done all 4 wheels, you can then reset your axles, put the body back on, and you're good to go. Right, so let's get the other 3 done, and then we can hit the track. there you are. You can see that this Mark II build has a very similar track time to my original Mark I. And I very much hope that you've enjoyed watching this second video, and I really hope that YouTube leaves this audio alone. So I'm really pleased with the way this car has come out, and I'm really pleased that I have actually had to make a second video based on my car, because this car is actually one of my most favourite builds on the whole of this channel. I really love its simplicity. It's a beautiful little car, and I'm very, very pleased that I've done it. And I hope that you've enjoyed watching this video, and if you have, maybe you'll subscribe and hit the little bell button. That would be awesome. So until the next time, thank you very much.